Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
Microsoft recently released their digital defense report, and we're going to talk about that tonight. There's an executive summary that we'll link in the show notes, as well as the full report. The full report is quite extensive. It's 114 pages, but it is a very, very good read. We'll talk about some of the things in the executive summary, and then I will pick out points that I found that were really interesting in the full report. But if you have time, I highly recommend going and reading, or at least skimming through the full report, because there is a ton of really, really good information in here. So the purpose of the digital defense report is just a report of all the things that Microsoft has been seeing as far as cybersecurity for the last year, and the rise of certain things, where certain attacks are coming from, attack vectors, nation state actors, all of that stuff. And so it's broken down into 5 major sections: the state of cybercrime, nation state threats, devices and infrastructure, cyber influence operations, and cyber resilience. So in the first section on the state of cybercrime, I'm going to read some of the executive summary because it's not very long. Microsoft says, as cyber defenses improve and more organizations are taking a proactive approach to prevention, attackers are adapting their techniques. Cyber criminals continue to act as sophisticated profit enterprises. Attacks are adapting and finding new ways to implement their techniques, and increasing the complexity of how and where they host campaign operations infrastructure. And at the same time, cyber criminals are becoming more frugal. To lower their overhead and boost the appearance of legitimacy, attackers are compromising business networks and devices to host phishing campaigns, malware, or even use their computing power to mine cryptocurrency. So I thought that was a good summary. It's not anything that's too surprising, but we've talked about how these criminal networks are basically acting like businesses. They have customer support. They're very tuned to try to get you to pay them, because that's how they make money. The whole cybercrime section has some major call outs. There's an entire section, very, very detailed, on human operated ransomware. And the type of ransomware that we're seeing in the wild from Microsoft going and having encounters with customers and incident response, human operated is still the most prevalent, as 1/3 of targets are successfully compromised by criminals, and 5% of those are still ransomed. There's a really interesting rate of success model that is in the report, where by the numbers, they'll have, say, 2,500 potential targets that have credentials compromised from like an access broker, and the broker will sell these credentials to ransomware as a service affiliates. And then from those targets, the ransomware as a service affiliates will prioritize them based on intended impact and perceived profit. So about 60 of those are going to be prioritized from the 2,500. And then they target them, and about 20 of those are successfully compromised by taking advantage of any type of security weakness in the network. And then out of those compromised, 1 falls victim to a successful ransomware attack, where you actually get the payload delivered, and the victim has to pay. So about 1 in 2,500, which I think just goes to show that it's just a game of attrition, really, for the attackers. They're trying to get as many potential targets as possible. They try to look at everything that each target has as far as weaknesses. And there's not really like, sometimes there is a specific target, but especially with human operating ransomware, the goal is just to get at least one person to pay in the end.
So if you listen to this show, you know we talk about Microsoft fairly regularly because we're employed by Microsoft, but also, I think we see it as an opportunity to educate the community that Microsoft is a pretty big play in the cybersecurity space. And so when you say, well, why is Microsoft writing a digital defense report? Well, first off, Microsoft is relatively unique in that they operate both consumer-facing as well as enterprise-facing services. So they have a wider diversity of data than many other like pure play enterprise security vendors. That's one. Number two is obviously the scope and scale of Microsoft is just huge. Number three is Microsoft also has a very deep incident response offering. If you have a support agreement with Microsoft, then you have the opportunity to engage Microsoft's incident response team, or DART team as it's called. And through all of those different opportunities, as well as just securing one of the most widely used operating systems in the world and one of the largest cloud infrastructure environments in the world, there's just a lot of interaction with the cybersecurity space. And so Microsoft does have a unique point of view there. And we've published this digital defense report now for many years, and it's always really compelling. So I think this is really, really good. Now, as far as kind of our first, subject area, the state of cybercrime, again, Andy kind of gave you the summary, and there's nothing new there. Like, I don't think anyone's really surprised by that. But at the same time, I think we really have to come to terms with the fact that the idea of like the lone hacker doing a hack for like notoriety still might exist, but or the hacker doing it just because they could or anything else, those aren't really prevalent today. It's a business, and its goal is to make money. And you walk through, kind of the background of it. Of I'm gonna buy from a broker 2,500 accounts, and then run it through a funnel and see how many I can get into. Well, these 60 look like promising. I'm going to go try to them. I'm going to successfully compromise 1/3 of those 60 that I target. And then I'm going to actually successfully ransom 1/20th of those. So a lot of that is, yes, there are many orgs. If you look at the math there, most orgs aren't going to be impacted, but the ones that are severely impacted. And this is where it's tempting to fall into a mindset of like, how do you outrun a tiger or a bear or whatever? You just have to be faster than the slowest person. That's kind of true here. But when you look at the scale of it, it's not the same model, because in that case, the tiger can only eat one thing at a time. These guys are guys and gals are buying access to 2,500 accounts and funneling through and seeing which ones they can hit. And if there's more than one, they're going to hit more than one. So that kind of mindset doesn't completely pay out. And they're trying to make money, so they're motivated. They have, they eye return on investment for you. And maybe you were going to say this in a moment, Andy, but I saw this in here that today, the ransomware technique of choice is that double extortion technique, where not only am I going to extort you to get access to your systems back, but I have also exfiltrated a whole bunch of your data, and I'm going to leak it if you don't pay me. So the kind of old model of, well, don't pay a ransom and then just try to restore your systems. Okay, well, you might have embarrassing stuff leaked if you follow that model. And if you pay the ransom, well, now you're just creating financial incentive for the system to persist. And you as an individual actor may not care about that, but we as an industry overall definitely care that we start to reduce financial incentives for these cyber criminals to continue. So the long-winded takeaway from all this is that the MO of attackers has changed. It's broadly financially driven today. They're very professional and very sophisticated about this. Their goal is to get paid, and targeting you is a way for them to do that. And so we have to go through a little bit of a mindset shift here on who we're facing and how well funded they are and how motivated they are, because their motivations are different than they were even just a couple of years ago.
And I will say, if you go through the main report, you'll see all of these different statistics and insight and threat intelligence on everything Microsoft has gathered for the last year. But most importantly, on each section, there is a call out for actionable insights. So how do you defend against this? And I'm not going to go through every single one, because a lot of it is fairly common things that we know, like implement MFA or implement conditional access or whatever, but for some of them, there are specific call outs. So one of the things that I found really interesting in the ransomware section was 3 main contributing factors that Microsoft found from their on-site engagements with victims who have been attacked. Weak identity controls. So not a single organization that Microsoft worked with this year on human-operated ransomware used privileged access workstations. Now, I know that they're very difficult to implement, but that was a pretty significant red flag for me, is that not a single one of them used it. And 88% of the engagements did not have MFA implemented for sensitive and high privileged accounts, which is also crazy. Mm-hmm. Ineffective security operations was number 2. 68% did not have effective vulnerability and patch management process, and they were highly dependent on manual processes versus automated patching, which led to the critical openings. And then finally, the third one was organizations struggled to implement effective data protection strategies. 44% did not have backups or recovery plans, and 92% did not have any type of data loss protection controls. And so right there, those 3 things were the main contributing factors that Microsoft saw. And then again, if you go through the report, there's going to be actionable insights on how you can get these controls implemented. There's also a spotlight on business email compromise, which is also part of the cybercrime trends. There's a rise in credential phishing, which if you listen to our last week's episode, they're trying to bypass MFA bombing, all of that. Those are on the rise, as well as invoice fraud. That's something that Microsoft called out here as well, where the majority of business email compromise attackers normally try to start a conversation and establish rapport. They were posing as colleagues or business acquaintances, and then they try to get them to pay that, invoice. Oh, here's a invoice from so-and-so. We need to get this done right now. And so that's, those are trends that Microsoft has been seeing.
This, and I'm sure listeners of our show are in a better place on this. But my goodness, MFA for every admin account, absolute table stakes. It's not something you have to roll out broadly. I mean, it's you're already technical people. That is like, you could go do that literally Monday morning. And if you haven't, please do. I get privileged access workstations, again, a ton of work, but clearly really do prevent these kind of takeovers. Vulnerability and patch management. This is kind of becoming a bigger thing. And Andy, I think at some point in the future, we're going to do a show on this because, I'm going to blank on his name. Mark Simos at Microsoft did this great, several posts on LinkedIn, a whole series around kind of the anti-patterns for patch management. And so people think like we need to do it this way. And here's why those are actually bad. And so I think people are starting to become familiar with the anti-patterns for passwords. Like with passwords, we've started to get a broader understanding that complexity requirements combined with humans who do not think like computers do not randomly distribute those complexity requirements. They do them in accordance with their understanding of like the English language and punctuation and capitalization. And so it actually becomes a very, very, very predictable pattern. As an example, expiring passwords that we know aren't compromised yet does not deliver security benefit. And if it is compromised, well, unless you nailed that expiration at the exact time the hacker is actively using it, the attacker, then there's no security benefit from it either. So all it does is make it harder for humans to remember good, solid passwords by forcing them to rotate them when there's nothing wrong with them. Those are examples of password anti-patterns. Patching, I think, is going to be the next frontier for this, because a lot of the traditional thought process around patching actually leads to risk. And as an example, and I think this is getting better, but you talked about 68% had a high dependence on manual processes versus automated patching. The whole idea that like an admin somewhere needs to sit through and go like, I'll install this, but not this, and I'll do that one, but not that one. Like that needs to be, moved to the waste bucket of computing history. You should deploy all patches all the time, unless and only you discover a showstopper, and you should have a deployment pattern in place so that you can discover that on a very small number of workstations before it's broadly impactful to your org. And you could pause it and you can pull it back and you can deal with it from there. But that is a way better way to find out than having someone kind of stick their finger in the air and measure the wind and decide which patches they're going to install today, because that's not an effective way to determine the actual risk inherent with all of them. And even if you're looking at like CVEs or CVSS scores or anything else, like still, it's a good example. So, I don't want to get on a big soapbox about that. And then the last one too, 92% didn't have data loss prevention controls. Not surprised. My former role at Microsoft was I was an identity and information protection technical specialist. And information protection, after years and years and years of talking about, I've been talking about information protection since 2017. So I've been selling it for 5.5 years. It's still like that lower item on the priority list. And it starts to bubble up and people get excited about it. And then something leapfrogs it. A new shiny thing comes out. A SIM, a SOAR, a CASB, EDR, XDR, whatever, SASE. And then it drops down the list again. And I'm not saying those other things aren't important, but the reason why I think technologists are hesitant to embrace information protection and data loss prevention is because it involves a significant human element. As they often would demonstrate, there's not that many controls here. The deployment of this from a configuration and technical perspective is relatively straightforward. The difficult part is getting the business to buy in, getting humans to buy in, and getting disparate groups like legal and compliance and risk all on the same page and at the same table and agreeing on like a sensitivity labeling taxonomy and how everything should be implemented technically. And as IT people, we kind of throw up our hands like, well, that's way more than I want to bite off, so I'm not going to deal with that. What's the new shiny buzzword in security instead? Let's go do that. And there's definitely opportunity there to harden and improve posture there as well and prevent exfiltration and all of that. So good call outs. And I appreciate that we're kind of making it actionable as opposed to just like, here's all the bad things that are happening. The sky is falling. The sky is not falling, but you know what I mean? Here's ways you can actually help improve your organization. So, I mean, if I'm highlighting takeaways here, to me, number one, MFA for all your sensitive accounts. And honestly, MFA for all your accounts, because if you don't do it now, you're going to do it next time you get breached. So maybe just get it done. Patch management, it's time to change your mind on that. And if you haven't yet, figure out a way to get everybody together and start to really build automation into that and get to a state where you take patches automatically and they go to a small group. And if they don't find any issues there, it proceeds to a larger group and so on. We're not going to say you should deploy pause, although you should, but we get that that's a much harder lift.
On the next section for nation state threats, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. Super interesting to read through. I mean, it's its own major section here, but the interesting thing I think is that Microsoft has found increasing cybersecurity attacks from nation states and the advent of cyber weapon deployment in a hybrid war in Ukraine is the dawn of a new age of conflict. And so the increase in frequency, the increase in sophistication, there were 4 nations that were specifically called out in this report. Obviously, Russia has had the majority of the news, but Iran has had several cyber attacks that have originated from them or attributed to Iran, China, and North Korea, all getting direct callouts in the report. And, the section talks about how nation-state actors have increased their activity and started using automation, cloud infrastructure, remote access technology to get a wider set of targets. Corporate IT supply chains are one of the most frequently targeted, and most frequently attacked. And cyber hygiene, cybersecurity hygiene, which we just talked about, but this becomes more of a critical factor because what Microsoft has found is actors are rapidly exploiting unpatched vulnerabilities. So as soon as the 0 day is announced and it's publicly disclosed, that time from when it's publicly disclosed to when it starts to be exploited is starting to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so, it makes it really essential that as soon as a security patch comes out, that organizations are patching immediately, because that's what these cyber criminals and specifically nation states are taking advantage of. And what Microsoft has seen is some of these 0 days will go unpatched for months. And I mean, it's a vulnerability and it's an exploit that has been patched, and organizations aren't doing that. So don't need to keep on beating the same point, but patching, it's one of the basic things, cybersecurity hygiene. Moving on to devices and infrastructure. So this section, the majority of it actually talked about IoT and OT technology. And it really, really highlighted the vulnerabilities that a lot of organizations that Microsoft has seen that have poor IoT and OT security. So the overview says the pandemic, coupled with rapid adoption of internet-facing devices of all kinds as a component of accelerating digital transformation, has greatly increased the attack surface of the digital world. And cyber criminals and nation states are quickly taking advantage. While the security of IT hardware and software has strengthened over the recent years, the security of Internet of Things, IoT, and operational technology, OT devices, has not kept pace. And threat actors are exploiting these devices to establish access on network, enable lateral movement to establish a foothold in a supply chain, or disrupt target organizations' OT operations. And so some significant bullets that I found when I'm reading through this section was that malware as a service has moved into large-scale operations against civil infrastructure and utilities, including hospitals, oil and gas, electric grids, transportation services, and other critical infrastructure. And millions of IoT devices are still unpatched or exposed. There's a common, I would say, default credentials. A lot of people, when they deploy IoT or OT devices, don't check the default credentials. And there's actually a chart in here which is pretty eye-opening on the combination of identical usernames and passwords that Microsoft has found over 39 million IoT and OT devices. So they've done this analysis, and there's a big chunk that is, I would say, close to 25%, maybe 20 to 25% is admin. Like literally, they just didn't change it, and it's admin. And there's user or Telenet admin. NC11 is a big chunk. NC11, and so default credentials. I mean, this is basic cybersecurity hygiene, right? Changing that and making sure that those are not default. Spotlight on firmware vulnerabilities. Oftentimes in these IoT and OT devices, it's really difficult to update the firmware, and attackers are leveraging those vulnerabilities in IoT device firmware to infiltrate the networks. out of a recent survey, I found this to be interesting. 68% of IT professionals believe that the adoption of IT and OT technology is critical to their digital transformation. However, 60% recognize that the security of IoT and OT devices are the least secure aspect of their infrastructure. And so I think that tracks, as Adam and I have talked with many manufacturing customers with IoT and OT devices. I mean, when it comes to like asking just the basic question, like how many IoT devices do you have? How many OT devices do you have? They don't have an inventory, right? So if you don't even know what you have, how can you secure it? So getting an inventory of that and, tracking malicious network activity. I think it's really hard to detect, if someone is in my IoT device, right? But you can, what is easy to detect is the activity that results from it. And so you got to have some sort of defense against that. In the security weaknesses of firmware images analyzed, I want to just call this out real quick. Again, weak passwords. 27% of firmware images scanned had accounts with default passwords or were encoded with weak algorithms like MD5 and DES. Known vulnerabilities was another one. IoT and OT devices firmware extensively lagged, or they extensively leveraged open source libraries, and the devices frequently shipped with out-of-date versions. In Microsoft's analysis, 32% of the images contained at least 10 known vulnerabilities, CVE rated as critical 9.0 or higher. 4% contained at least 10 critical vulnerabilities that were more than 6 years old. Expired certificates was a third one. Certificates were used to authenticate connections and identities as well as protect sensitive data, but 13% of the images that were analyzed contained at least 10 certificates that had expired more than 3 years ago. And then finally, with these IoT firmware images, the software component, 36% of the images contained software components that Microsoft recommends to be excluded in IoT devices, such as packet capture tools like TCP dump, library PCAP, which can be leveraged for network reconnaissance as part of an attack chain. So you're literally installing tools to help attackers, do network reconnaissance. And to be fair, these can be things that are helpful to admins, but these aren't things that should be on IoT devices. It's the same thing as if you were to install like Notepad++ on a domain controller. Like, shouldn't be installing software packages on things that should be kept clean, where attackers can then just take advantage of whatever vulnerability it has if you haven't updated, which is really hard to do on IoT and OT devices.
Andy, you mentioned, so we both uniquely and exclusively cover manufacturing customers. And if anybody has exposure to OT and IoT risk, it's them. And of course, we're talking to customers, we're talking about security. And like Andy said, we'll ask the most softball questions. And this isn't calling people out. What I'm doing is identifying what I think is the risk here and why the risk is here. So we'll ask softball questions like, how are you protecting your OT environment? How many OT devices do you have? And, earlier when Andy brought it up, I shrugged for those of you listening on audio. They don't know. And the reason they don't know is because operations has traditionally been a completely separate part of the company from IT. IT is to enable like the information worker, like the back office worker. As far as the frontline worker, that's operations space, and they don't want IT playing in their sandbox. They've got this. You nerds don't understand how to actually manufacture something anyway, so stay out of our business. And so you get this like hard separation. And the challenge is you have all these devices that sit on networks that have possibly insecure default usernames and passwords. They have old libraries that have multi-year-old vulnerabilities, high CVE scores, expired certificates, useful tools for recon, like all of these things. And I think most like IT infosec security people, they know there's risk there, but they're not empowered to stop it. Like they haven't been given the green light to go protect that, to go look at that. And CISOs even kind of get the same thing of like, well, that's kind of more of the COO space. It's not mine. And so I think until we kind of tear down that wall and we treat everything connected to a network as stuff we all have a joint responsibility to protect, these problems are going to persist. And that's the real challenge here. So we got to break down those walls to start protecting this stuff because it's really critical.
So the next section talks about cyber influence operations. And I thought it was really interesting to have an entire section dedicated to cyber influence. We did have Charity Wright on our show from who's an expert in threat intelligence, and her specialty is China influence operations. And so this was a really interesting section to read through. Again, not going to do a deep dive on this, but we'll read some of the highlights here. And if you are interested, there's actually some takeaways and ways that you can protect your organization from influence operations. But reading from the report here, today's foreign influence operations utilize new methods and technologies, making their campaigns designed to erode trust more efficiently and effectively. Nation states are increasingly using sophisticated influence operations to distribute propaganda and impact public opinion, both domestically and internationally. These campaigns erode trust, increase polarization, and threaten democratic processes. Skilled, advanced, persistent manipulation actors are using traditional media together with internet and social media to vastly increase the scope and scale and efficiency of their campaigns and the outsized impact they are having on global information ecosystem. In the past year, we've seen these operations used as part of Russia's hybrid war in Ukraine, but also seen Russia and other nations, including China and Iran, increasingly turn to social media powered propaganda operations to extend their global influence. So again, some call outs with Russia, China, Iran, not surprising. The influence operations section does a huge deep dive on COVID-19 propaganda from Russia, Iran, and China. And they talked about how these campaigns have been featured in two different ways: representation of the pandemic itself, and then campaigns that used COVID-19 as a strategic device to achieve broader political objectives. And then there's a whole section which I thought was really interesting on synthetic media. And what Microsoft has found is that we're entering a golden era for AI-enabled media creation and manipulation. And Microsoft's analysts note that this was driven by two key trends: the proliferation of easy-to-use tools and services for artificially creating high realistic synthetic images, videos, audio, and text, and the ability to quickly disseminate content optimized for specific audiences. 900% year over year in increased proliferation of deepfakes since 2019. And so deepfakes are basically where you're synthetically generating a face. Like I could put Adam's face over some video of someone saying something and it looks like Adam is saying it, but it's really not. And so that is really concerning because it's harder and harder to tell what is the truth and what is real. And the average Joe is not going to be able to take a look at a video and see if it's been altered, like in the movies where, oh, I can see that this has been digitally altered for Adam's face. Like, we're not going to be able to do that. We just see it for what it is. And media is moving so fast these days. They're picking up stories and not vetting them. And so this is a problem that Microsoft is seeing, and they're calling it out in this section.
I think the deepfake stuff kind of freaks me out the most. And, it's funny, you can fall into so many different kind of unique corners of the internet without even really trying. So when I started using TikTok, one of the first follows I did was Frank Caliendo, who's a master of really funny impersonations. He's really, really good at it. And so by nature of following him, then I started following other people who are also really skilled impersonators. And the new thing that I've just started noticing people do is using deepfakes with their ability to impersonate voices to put actors who weren't originally in a movie. Like they're doing funny things like making every character Christopher Walken in a movie, or making every character Arnold Schwarzenegger in a movie. And it's really funny. But at the same time, you're sitting there laughing and you're going, oh, this is great. But then you realize this could be easily used for political purposes, and you can think of, there are certainly groups of people who already believe deeply untrue things in this country. And if we could add video to that looks completely real and authentic, to embolden their claims, it could only, create more polarization. And that's a political risk, but you can certainly even see this as cybersecurity risk too, right? Information security risk just as easily. What if somebody sends you a video that looks like your CEO is saying something that he really didn't say? It could be used to polarize employees of a company, to maybe create some insider risk, all sorts of things. So even something that can be used for funny, benign purposes, that's just innocent little fun of, here's Arnold Schwarzenegger playing a character he normally wouldn't play in a movie. You start to go down that rabbit hole real quick. And I see that as definitely a major, major risk moving forward. And don't have a lot of good answers for how we protect against that, but that story is just starting to unfold.
The final section is cyber resilience. And so if I were to boil down the main sections that I would recommend if you're like short on time to read through, it would definitely be the first section on cybercrime, the section on devices and infrastructure for IoT and OT devices, if that's of interest to you. And then the cyber resilience section is phenomenal. This is probably, in my opinion, the best part of the report. And so this talks about how, and what cyber resilience means is really the ability of an enterprise to continue operations and sustain growth acceleration despite disruptions, including cyber attacks. Cybersecurity is a key enabler in technology success. And in this section, they talk about how, there are certain things that you can do, including working with people. Adam talked about how information protection, there's a human element to it. And in this section, there's a whole section dedicated to the human factor. So just reading some of the overview here, innovation and enhanced productivity can only be achieved by introducing security measures that make organizations resilient as possible against modern attacks. The pandemic has challenged us to pivot our security practices and technology to protect Microsoft's employees wherever they work. The past year, threat actors continue to take advantage of vulnerabilities exposed during the pandemic and shift to a hybrid work environment. Since then, our principal challenge has been managing the prevalence of complexity of various attack methods and increased nation-state activity. So there are several sections in this one, and I won't talk about every single one, but one of the first sections was the importance of modernizing systems and architecture. So what Microsoft has found is there's a lack of, the danger of having legacy systems is going to impact your cyber resiliency. And there's a chart in here that I'll just read through some of these numbers, but it shows a percentage of impacted customers missing basic security controls, which were critical to the cyber resiliency of each one of these customers.
This chart
for
is
example,
incredible.
Yeah. So for example, 90% of the customers had insecure Active Directory configuration. Again, not something that's surprising, but if you know you have insecure Active Directory configurations, you need to work at that. That's something that you work at one policy every day or every month, increasing it just a little bit better, and so legacy hashing algorithms, 84% of customers that Microsoft analyzed still had legacy hashing algorithms, legacy authentication protocols, insecure Azure Active Directory configuration, 72%. Like we called this one out earlier, 100% had no use of privileged access workstations. 98% no privileged isolation in Active Directory via a tier model. So you're not separating out your domain admins in a different tier and having privileged isolation there. 98% excessive admin credentials found. Again, not surprising, but these are things that are trending, and these are things that affect customer cyber resiliency. 82% had a lack of secure developmental lifecycle practices for DevOps. 86% had insecure design for configuration across cloud platforms. 88% no zero trust of security framework adoption. I mean, we've been harping on zero trust for years. And in this report, we found that 88% of customers hadn't even adopted a single framework. So, yeah, I mean, it's not surprising, but when you see the numbers and they're empirical numbers and it's objective, it's really hard to, I guess, process for me that we've been harping on this stuff for years and it's still not really making a difference. We talked about device discovery when Adam and I, asked customers like how many of these devices. There's an average of 3,500 connected devices in an enterprise that are not protected by endpoint detection or response agent. So they're unmanaged devices. And what Microsoft has found is that these unmanaged devices pose a threat to your organization. One of the things, and I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but one of the features that I talk about with customers as far as Defender for Endpoint is the ability to discover unmanaged devices and then be able to isolate those devices from your corporate networks. So if that's, if you have a way to do it, at least block them from communicating with your managed devices. Password attacks are still common. 90% of accounts compromised by these methods were not protected by strong authentication, which in this report, they defined strong authentication by just password and one additional method, even if it was SMS. So 90% of those accounts didn't even have SMS MFA enabled on it when they were compromised through a password attack. There was a large section on software supply centrality, which when I read through this, I thought it was really interesting because what Microsoft has found is that there's only a small percentage of widely deployed application. Like Microsoft has, on Windows, you have 18 million applications, but only the top half of 1% are widely deployed that are used on more than 1,000 devices. And so if you want to try to affect an organization, you're going to find a vulnerability in these top half 1% applications. So if there's a vulnerability in one of those, you got to patch it because attackers are going to use that vulnerability because that software is so widely used. So if there's a vulnerability in Adobe Acrobat or Microsoft Word, I mean, those are widely used software applications. Attackers are going to use those. And then the other thing was diversity and manageability. Microsoft found that because there were so many applications that were third party, there's an interdependency on a company's software supply chain that you're depending on those software developers to maintain their security and compliance. Microsoft observed that there were millions of commercial devices still using vulnerable application versions, even months after patch release. So we're talking the software, not the operating system, and that there were more than 1 million active Windows commercial devices running a version of a PDF reader that had not been supported since 2017. When they examined a critical vulnerability that affected 134 versions of a set of browsers. Microsoft found that 78% or 1 million devices still used one of those versions 9 months after a patch had been released. Like, that should not be the case. Browsers, PDF readers, like, I would set these things to automatically update. And as soon as the user launches it, or force it if you can, if you have software management. But this was concerning as far as just software usage and keeping software up to date. We're not even talking about patching. These are vulnerabilities that will affect your cyber resiliency. Real quick, there was a section on DDoS protection. I'm not going to dive too deep, but Microsoft has seen a rise in DDoS attacks, and so part of your organization's cyber resiliency is to shore up your defenses against this. We're going to do a show dedicated around DDoS protection. So, but if you're interested, read through that section as well. The human dimension, like I said, the technology is only one part of the piece of the puzzle. And so it takes education, media literacy, awareness, investments in quality journalism. They talked about having trusted reporters, both locally, nationally, and internationally. And then fortifying that human factor with skilling. Microsoft found that 46% of cybersecurity incidents involve careless or uninformed staff who inadvertently facilitated the attack. And additionally, there's a whole section talking about how we should integrate security and business together. Adam was spot on when he talked about how, the operations part has traditionally been separate, and cybersecurity has not been given the leeway or even the approval to, quote unquote, meddle with it. And so we really have to start integrating parts of the business with security so that everyone has an idea of what's impacting from risk that could impact the organization. So there's a whole section on integrating business security and IT. There is a section on quantum security. I also found this was interesting that they called this out, that they're saying that you should act now on quantum security implications. Adam and I have done multiple shows on quantum cryptology and quantum encryption, quantum computing. But the actual insights I found were interesting. So I'm just going to read some of these when it comes to quantum security. If this impacts you, take an inventory of products and code that use cryptography. So if you're using cryptography within your products or the stuff that you're shipping to maybe your customers, implement a crypto agility strategy across your organization that includes minimizing code churn required when cryptography changes. Pilot the use of candidate quantum safe algorithms in your products and services that use cryptography. And then be prepared to use different public key algorithms for encryption, key exchange, and signatures. So I thought the crypto agility was interesting because, I think it's pretty difficult to just say, I'm going to change my cryptography algorithm in my code. But that's what Microsoft is saying, is that you should start implementing that, have an agile, developmental life cycle. And finally, I think the good news with the whole report here is that basic security hygiene still protects against 98% of the attacks. So all the things that we've been harping on, which I'm sure every single one of the listeners that we have are doing, enable multi-factor, apply zero trust principles, use modern anti-malware, keep up to date patching, and then protect your data. Those 5 things, the basic things, which, my previous boss, he would always say, like, I'm not worried about the 0 days. I'm worried about the things that we're not doing that are the basic things. And so I think that, again, take that back as your main takeaway, is that 98% of the attacks are still being thwarted by the basic attacks here.
lot here in the cyber resiliency section. This chart that Andy talked about, so the key issues impacting cyber resiliency, if you go read the report, really impactful, really, really good. The quantum stuff's interesting. I just like the idea that kind of making your code portable so that your app code doesn't really care what cryptography algorithm you're using. That's a great idea. And then, do the basics.
So hopefully you take some time to read through the report, at least skim through it. The main sections I would say, again, are the cybercrime, the devices and infrastructure, and the cyber resiliency. If you're interested in the threat operations and the threat intelligence on the cyber influence operations and nation state actors, I think that's good to have as situational awareness. I'm not sure most organizations are, at that level. Certainly Microsoft is, but if you're a smaller organization, I think these other three sections have a ton of great information and to-dos to go back and take a look. So that's our show for this week. Thanks for listening and watching. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.